Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I always hated Christmas dinner, but that year, it had a particular kind of sharpness to it, the kind that lingers under your skin like a splinter you can't reach. The lights were the same, blinking in quiet rhythm around the living room arch. The old china was set out, the one with the tiny blue flowers my mother swore was passed down from her grandmother, and the smell of cinnamon-glazed ham filled the house like a manufactured version of warmth. Everything was as it always was, except this time, I was seated at the table knowing more than anyone else knew, and just barely holding onto the leash wrapped around my tongue. Dad had already had 2 glasses of red, and the corners of his mouth were turning loose like they always did when he got just tipsy enough to think he was being funny. Emily sat on his right, glowing like a well-fed house cat. Her new fiancé's absence blamed on some emergency flight change, though her phone buzzed every few minutes with messages she swiped away like fruit flies. Mom was doing her usual routine, smiling through gritted teeth, offering food like it could fix anything, while eyeing me like I was an overcooked casserole she didn't know what to do with. And I was watching it all quietly, sipping my own wine like I was at the theater. The moment he said it, I felt it before I registered the words. His voice was calm, amused even, as he looked down the table at me and said, "Your sister just got engaged. When will you do something worth celebrating?" He said it with that slight headshake, the way you might look at a kid who flunked out of college and still thought they deserved a party. He wasn't trying to be subtle. He never was. I didn't look at him right away. I let it hang there in the air like smoke, heavy and clinging, watching Emily's fork pause midair, and Mom's eyes widen for a split second before she went back to buttering a roll like nothing had happened. That's what families do, right? Pretend, dodge, rearrange their faces before the fallout. But I wasn't in the mood to play along this time. I'd had enough of looking like the screw-up at the table just because I didn't come with a Hallmark resume and a Stepford smile. I took a sip of my wine, let it settle in my mouth for a second, and then said very calmly, "Funny, my wife said the same thing about you." The room didn't go quiet. It died. Not the kind of silence that follows an awkward comment or a joke that lands wrong, but the kind that stretches into something else entirely. Confusion, recognition, and fear, all rolled up into one breathless moment. Emily's lips parted just slightly, like she was about to say something but couldn't decide what. Mom blinked 3 times and stared down at her mashed potatoes like they were suddenly fascinating. Dad's face didn't move, not at first. It just froze. I watched him absorb it, like a snake tasting air, trying to figure out where the strike had come from. His ego was scrambling to decide whether I was being disrespectful or if I had just exposed something real. And that's the thing. I hadn't even started yet. That wasn't the punchline. That was the opening act. He leaned forward slowly, squinting at me like he wasn't sure I was still his daughter. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged. "It means what it means." He scoffed, and that puffed-up masculinity started to bubble up in his chest like carbonation. Always with the damn riddles. No wonder Laura walked out. That was a mistake, a big one, because the thing he didn't know, the thing I had been holding back for weeks, was that Laura didn't walk out. She was pushed, and not by me. That's when I smiled. Just a little, because this man, this father of mine, sitting at the head of the table he had ruled over like a petty king for 40 years, had no idea he was seated on a trapdoor, and I had the rope. I saw Emily shift uncomfortably, her fingers curling around the stem of her glass. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to know I wasn't bluffing. And that, in a way, was even better, because fear has a scent, and I'd been sniffing it off her since I walked in the door. It's funny how families pretend things are fine, as long as nobody says anything real. The roast can be dry, the glances icy, the love fake, but as long as everyone keeps their mouths shut, we call it tradition. But I wasn't interested in preserving the lie anymore. I was here for the truth, ugly and loud and overdue. And the best part? I hadn't even gotten to the real reason I was smiling yet. But don't worry, I would. Because when someone asks you, At a Christmas dinner, no less. Why your life isn't worth celebrating, and you happen to be sitting on a nuclear secret that could rip their favorite child's life apart. The polite thing to do is pass the gravy. The right thing? Well, that's a whole different story. The thing people never seem to understand about silence is that it has weight. Thick, invisible, almost tangible in its pressure. And that night, as the tension rolled through the dining room like a storm cloud pressed against the ceiling, no one dared move too fast or breathe too deeply, as if even the slightest sound might detonate something they hadn't yet seen. But I knew exactly what had been lit. That wasn't just a sarcastic comeback flung from across the table to even the score. That was the first move in a game I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks, maybe even months, depending on where you want to place the real beginning of betrayal. And from the way Emily's hand trembled slightly around her wine glass, I could tell she had just realized I wasn't playing around. The weeks before Christmas had been brutal in a quiet, humiliating way. The kind where pain isn't shouted from the rooftops, but delivered in low-volume conversations behind doors that don't close all the way and in the unread texts from someone who used to kiss your neck in the morning while the coffee brewed. Laura and I had already been drifting, and when she said she needed space, I believed her, because that's what I do. I believe people, especially the ones I love, even when they start slipping through your fingers like water, even when your instincts start whispering that something doesn't line up. It started with the usual nonsense, busy schedules, work stress, canceled dinners, but then came the night I saw a text pop up on her phone when she left it unlocked on the kitchen counter. It wasn't explicit, at least not in the way you might expect, but it was worse. It was intimate, familiar, casual, like they'd been doing it for a while. I can't stop thinking about last Tuesday. You smelled like vanilla and trouble. The name attached to it nearly knocked the breath out of me. Emily, my sister. Now maybe you think the obvious thing would have been to confront Laura, demand an explanation, shout, cry, break a plate, or do anything that would resemble a sane person's response to discovering that the woman you married had crawled into bed with your own blood. But I didn't. I sat with it. I let it rot in my chest. I watched, and I waited, because the one thing I've learned after years of being the black sheep, the forgotten daughter, the one who always got the blame while Emily got the praise, is that sometimes revenge is sweeter when it's slow, served cold, and shared at the same table where they once feasted on your humiliation. So I didn't tell a soul, not Laura, not Emily, not even my therapist, who probably could have picked up on it if she wasn't so obsessed with holding space and other vague nonsense that feels good in a journal, but doesn't help when your world is burning from the inside out. I waited until that dinner, until Dad made his comment, until every mask was hanging loosely from the string, and then I pulled. So, I said, leaning slightly in Emily's direction, careful to keep my voice just soft enough to sound innocent but loud enough to silence any side conversations. How long were you and Laura texting before I moved out? It was surgical. A single sentence, casual in tone, but sharpened with precision. Emily froze mid-chew, her fork half raised to her mouth like she'd forgotten what it was for. Her face didn't flush, not right away, but her eyes flicked to Dad's, to Mom's, then back to me, and in that brief moment, she looked more like a cornered animal than the elegant little golden child she'd been pretending to be since we were kids. She didn't answer, and she didn't need to, not for me, and not for anyone else at that table with a working sense of context. Dad coughed, one of those stiff, old man coughs meant to reclaim attention, and said, "What the hell are you talking about?" The way he emphasized hell made it sound like I'd just spoken some foreign profanity at the altar of our family's fragile peace. And that made me smile, because I knew it would be easier for him to believe I was acting out than to entertain even the slightest possibility that his perfect youngest daughter had clawed her way into her sister's marriage like a snake looking for warmth. Mom, for her part, reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers cold and shaking, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Claire, honey, maybe this isn't the time." And I cut her off with a look that made her pull her hand back as though she'd touched a burner. "Oh, I think this is exactly the time," I said, now directing my gaze back to Emily, who had placed her fork down and was staring at me like I had just revealed her darkest secret to a crowd of strangers on live television. "You remember that hotel on 9th and Glover? Laura said you liked that place. Said it reminded you of New Orleans. Funny, I thought you hated the heat." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, but the words just didn't come. And it was perfect. Because the real power in these moments isn't in the screaming or the crying. It's in making someone confront the version of themselves they thought no one else had seen. The silence returned again, heavier this time, thicker, and this time it was mine. I owned it. And I let it sit there, stretching out like an uncomfortable truth no one had the guts to challenge. Because what could they say? I hadn't accused. I hadn't screamed. I'd only asked questions, innocent, loaded, unforgiving questions. And I wasn't done. Not even close. The thing about power, real, devastating, unshakable power, is that most people don't recognize it until it's already being used against them. And by the time my sister's smile had crumbled and my father's chair gave that familiar scrape against the hardwood floor, the realization was setting in that this wasn't just a momentary spat or one of my episodes they'd quietly dismiss after dessert, but something entirely different, something colder, older, and far more deliberate than anything they'd expected when they laid out the fine tablecloth and polished the silverware that morning. He stood up slowly, hands flat on the table like he was about to deliver a sermon or swing it across the room. But he didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me, hard, squinting, confused, as if the daughter he thought he had raised had somehow been replaced by a stranger with a sharper tongue and a dangerous amount of clarity. I knew that look. I'd seen it 100 times growing up, that stunned expression he wore the night he found out I'd gotten into the state university without his help, the day I told him I was marrying a woman instead of some nice boy from church, the time I didn't call him for 6 months after he told me I'd grow out of this phase if I stopped being stubborn. But this time, there was something else beneath the squint. Fear, maybe, or guilt, or at least the early flickering awareness that he was about to lose control of the very illusion he'd spent a lifetime curating. "I don't know what you're implying," he finally said, each word measured like stepping through a minefield. "But this is not the place, and that is not how we talk about family." I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, not really, but because the hypocrisy hung so thick in the room it was almost suffocating. My father, the man who had weaponized shame like a family heirloom, suddenly wanted to draw a line in the sand about respect and timing, as though the dinner table hadn't always been his chosen battlefield when it came to reminding me I was never quite enough. Every major holiday growing up had come with a speech about how Emily was excelling, how Claire needed to focus, how success looked a certain way, and I was squinting at it from the wrong angle. So for him to pretend now, in this moment, that the dinner table was sacred ground, well, that was rich. "I'm not implying anything, Dad," I replied slowly, letting the silence between each word do as much damage as the words themselves. "I'm just trying to understand how the math works. Like, if your daughter's wife cheats on her with your other daughter, is that still a family matter, or do we call it something else?" That was when the glass cracked. Not literally, though I half expected someone to throw something, but metaphorically, that fragile veneer of forced civility shattered, and I saw it in his eyes, the panic, the disbelief, the fury, curling behind clenched teeth. Mom inhaled sharply, covering her mouth like I'd shouted a curse word in church, and Emily's lips parted, finally forming sound, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." The sad part, truly, was that I hadn't even scratched the surface yet. Because what Emily didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just found the text. I'd found the others. The ones where she told Laura she wished she could go back in time. Where she said she never really thought I was good enough for Laura. Where she called me a phase in leather boots, which would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. She'd said worse. She'd sent photos. And the day after I found them, I sat on the bathroom floor of our apartment, holding her phone in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, wondering if this was what it meant to be invisible, to give someone all of you and find out you were just a layover on their way to something shinier. You don't know what it was like, Emily said, a little louder now, her voice cracking like a windshield in winter. You don't know how unhappy she was. That was the moment I felt the shift. Not in them, not in the room, but in me. Because up until that point, I had been angry, yes, and hurt, certainly, but underneath it all was still that old familiar ache. The desire to be understood, to be heard, to be validated in a family that had always seen me as a disruption, a deviation. But when she said that, when she tried to justify what she had done, not with an apology but with a rationalization, it clicked. There was no redemption here. There was no understanding, only war. I know exactly how unhappy she was, I said, my voice steady, cool, sharp. She told me, every time she came back from your place smelling like Chanel and cheap wine. Dad slammed his hand on the table, a loud, hollow thud that made the plates rattle and the candles flicker. Enough, he barked, his face red, eyes bulging, the vein in his temple pulsing like a warning light. That's your sister. You don't talk to family that way. I turned to him slowly, the wine glass still in my hand, and looked him dead in the eye. You don't get to decide how I talk to the people who set fire to my life and handed me the matches. You lost that right the day you told me to smile through it. And then I took another sip, not because I needed the wine, but because I needed the pause, the silence, the weight, the knowledge that for once I wasn't the one squirming under their gaze. I was the one watching them burn under mine. This wasn't about justice anymore. This wasn't even about revenge. This was about truth. And I still had more to tell. There's a moment somewhere between the unraveling and the explosion where everything feels too quiet, too calm, like the breath just before a scream or the hush that follows an unexpected confession in a church pew. And in that thin space, between the breaking of dinner etiquette and the unspooling of carefully wrapped lies, I sat with my fingers curled around a wine glass I'd long since stopped tasting, watching my family react not as people in shock, but as creatures trying to return to the safety of their constructed delusions. Maggie, still mom to Emily, but no longer that to me in any practical sense, had begun her usual routine of damage control, offering refills, stacking plates, scraping food into plastic containers as though salvation could be found in leftovers. And for a moment, I let her live in that space because it was a familiar script, and everyone at that table had memorized their lines for decades. But I wasn't finished, not even close, and the act of carving truth at a table where lies had always been the main course required more than a single snide comment or a shocking reveal. It demanded patience, precision, and the brutal commitment to keep cutting even when your hands started to shake. Because once the first slice is made, you either finish the job or admit you never really had the stomach for it. I had the stomach for it. Emily had gone pale, the kind of pale that isn't about embarrassment or shame, but about exposure, the raw, icy kind of vulnerability that makes people dangerous, not because they've been hurt, but because they realize the narrative they controlled is slipping through their fingers like sand. And I could see it all over her face, that moment of recalculation, the eyes darting, the lips twitching, the mind racing to find the next lie that might still hold some weight in the room. But I wasn't going to give her that chance. You want to know what's really funny? I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table like we were just two sisters catching up over brunch, and not two women sitting in the ruins of their shared history. It's not just that you slept with my wife, Emily. It's that you told her you were better for her because I was too cold, too busy, too stubborn, because I'd rather be right than be loved. And maybe you were right. Maybe I was hard to love, but I never lied to her. I never lied to anyone. Emily opened her mouth, and for a second, I thought she might go the apology route. Shaky voice, trembling lip, crocodile tears. But instead what came out was something far uglier and somehow more revealing. She told me she was never in love with you, she said quietly, eyes narrowed, like she was lobbing a grenade disguised as sympathy. She said you were just convenient. Convenient. That word hung in the air like poison, like rot, like the echo of something you can't unhear. And I felt it hit, deep and cold, not because it was new, but because I had feared it for so long that all the nights I spent trying to make our life together work, the therapy sessions, the carefully written birthday cards, the silent compromises, had been seen as placeholders rather than proof of devotion. I let the silence stretch, because silence, in moments like this, is a scalpel. Then I exhaled, set down my glass, and smiled. Not because I found it amusing, but because I finally felt free of it. Then it's a good thing she lost the baby, I said, with a calmness that stunned even me. The gasp that followed wasn't theatrical, it was visceral. Mom dropped the serving spoon she was holding, and it clattered against the edge of the bowl like a bell tolling for the dead. Dad stiffened, not because he understood, but because he didn't. And Emily, she went still. "What are you talking about?" she asked, voice trembling, hand shaking just slightly as she reached for her glass but didn't lift it. "You didn't tell them?" I asked, tilting my head, feigning surprise that felt just barely exaggerated. "You didn't tell them you were pregnant? That you lost it last month? Or that Laura was the one who drove you to the clinic?" Maggie made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. But I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Emily, who now looked more like a child caught with stolen candy than the woman who had strutted into this dinner expecting praise and applause for a fake engagement and a meticulously rehearsed lie. "You're lying, pun," Emily whispered, but the words didn't land. "You're making this up." I shook my head slowly, not with pity, but with precision. "You want to know how I know? Because she told me everything. The date, the clinic, the ride back, where you cried the whole time and asked her if she thought I'd ever forgive you if I found out. And you know what she said?" Emily didn't respond. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She said no. She said I'd never forgive you. And for once she was right. That was it. That was the kill shot. And in a way, it didn't feel as good as I thought it would. It felt final, heavy, real, like letting go of something you'd held for so long it had reshaped your entire body. I looked around the table, Mom now crying softly into a napkin, Dad silently seething in a kind of impotent rage he didn't know how to contain, and Emily frozen, exposed, silent. And for the first time in years, I felt still. Because the truth had been served, bloody, broken, and brutal, and it was mine. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that descends after destruction, a silence not born of peace, but of something more unsettling, an absence where structure once stood, a vacuum where pretense once thrived. And as I looked around the wreckage of that dining room, I didn't see a family anymore. Not really, not in the way they'd always insisted we were. Not in the glossy, forced smiles of Christmas cards, or the half-hearted traditions dragged out year after year, like the bones of something long dead and taxidermied into motion. What I saw instead was the aftermath of a truth too heavy to digest and too corrosive to ignore. And though the plates still sat on the table and the candles still flickered like nothing had changed, everything had, because the stories they told themselves had shattered, and there was no going back to the fiction they so desperately clung to. My father hadn't spoken since I dropped the final piece, that last jagged edge of revelation that sliced through the air like a guillotine, and for a man who had built his entire identity around control, of the room, of the narrative, of the people around him, his silence was louder than any rage he might have thrown across the table. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap from the tension, and for once, he didn't have a script, didn't have a retort, didn't have one of his usual retreaded speeches about respect or family honor, or keeping things in the family. He had nothing, because when faced with the truth, raw, unfiltered, and inescapable, he was just a man, not a father, not a patriarch, not a moral compass, just a man who had let rot flourish under his roof while pretending he couldn't smell it. Emily hadn't moved either, Though her hand trembled slightly against the linen napkin she now held in her lap like a shield, eyes cast downward as though by refusing to look up, she might somehow disappear from the moment, as if closing her eyes to the consequences could rewind the damage already done. I should have felt triumphant, I suppose. And maybe a part of me did, some cold, brittle shard of myself that had long since stopped believing in reconciliation or fairness or any version of justice that didn't come with a price. But mostly what I felt was tired. Tired of carrying the burden of being the truth teller in a family that only ever valued silence and survival. Tired of bearing the weight of their denial. Tired of screaming into emotional voids and hoping for echoes that never came. So when I stood slowly and deliberately, the legs of my chair scraping against the floor, with a sound that felt both final and necessary, I didn't do it to storm out or make a scene. I did it because the performance was over, the story had been told, and all that remained was the closing act. I lifted my glass one last time, though the wine had long since lost its warmth, and raised it slightly in the direction of the man who had, with a single sentence, set this entire unraveling into motion. "You wanted a celebration, Dad?" I said, voice steady, unwavering, slicing clean through the tension like a scalpel through skin. "Here's to the truth. Here's to the moment your daughters stop pretending. One of us is a liar, one of us is a coward, and one of us finally stopped giving a damn." He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't even flinch, because in that moment, he knew I wasn't just speaking about Emily or Laura or even the twisted love triangle we danced around. I was talking about him, about the decades of favoritism, the constant undermining, the silent expectations he carved into our bones, and then blamed us for bleeding. He had wanted trophies, reflections, daughters who made him feel like a man who had done everything right, and instead, he had ended up with one broken, one manipulative, and one unwilling to carry his delusions any longer. Mom tried, as she always did, to soften it, to mend the unmendable with her quiet pleas and her whispered name, "Claire, please." But I didn't look at her, didn't give her the comfort of a gaze or the reassurance of gentleness, because she too had played her part, had allowed the silence, had fostered the imbalance by pretending it didn't exist. And now, in the ruins of what she called family, she could finally see what looking away had cost her. I didn't slam the glass down, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just set it gently on the table, the sound a soft clink that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. And I walked out, step by step, through the kitchen that still smelled of cranberry and cloves, past the staircase I used to sit on as a child when I couldn't sleep, into the hallway lined with portraits that now felt like gravestones for a family that had never really existed outside the edges of those frames. Outside, the air was cold, sharp, honest in the way winter always is, no frills, no false warmth, just clarity. And as I stepped onto the front porch, I didn't feel free, not exactly, but I did feel something close to clean. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I would say to Laura if I ever saw her again, or if I even wanted to. I didn't know if Emily would spin another story to explain away what had happened, or if my father would ever speak my name without that bitter taste in his mouth. But I did know one thing. I had finally said the thing I wasn't supposed to say, done the thing I wasn't supposed to do. And while that made me the villain in their story, it made me the hero in mine. And that, to me, was worth celebrating.